Hey, good evening, everybody. As promised, as soon as we had the announcement of the new Pope, we would get Kevin and Net on as soon as possible. And he is busy as hell right now, but he has made time for us folks to come on this evening and give his discourse on how satanic is this new Pope, the Vatican, the Church, the crimes. So please support Kevin's important work. All of his links are in the description box below this video. Many of you have said that you are enjoying his book. Link is also down there in the description box. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. But let's not make them too esoteric like last time. Let's keep the questions within the realm of what we're talking about this evening. So huge thank you for coming back so soon, Kevin.
Thanks for having me. No, it's really good we talk about this today. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been watching on the news the black smoke emissions. What does all that stuff mean?
It's pretty, like you say, esoteric. It goes back hundreds of years. So I don't know. I frankly, I don't know, but I've heard different references to what it means.
So that's how they announced. That's how they announced the new Pope. Is it that they've made a decision? Is through the smoke?
Well, you know, officially that's what they do. It's part of the show to make it seem like there's been a choice and a democratic process, right?
All right. So now that we know who he is, Robert Pope Leo XIV. What is his background? We'll start with that one. I'll get a picture up of him. There he is.
Well, you know, the press is making a big thing about this, like it's the first American Pope ever elected. The reality is he's referred to in the College of Cardinals as the second Latin American Pope. And that's because even though, yeah, he was born in Chicago, raised in the Midwest of the US, he became a priest and very quickly got involved in this thing called the Augustinian Order, which are a bunch of missionaries. And he went as a missionary to Peru. And that's where he did all his work, right up to the point of being appointed cardinal. Just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, Pope Francis Jorge Bergoglio, the other Latin American, appoints him as a cardinal. And some people are speculating that this is because he was kind of Bergoglio's hand-picked successor. And the more you dig into this guy, the more interesting it gets. When you talk about, is this Pope satanic? Well, by definition, all of them are, because they're part of a satanic institution. As we mentioned before, they're not allowed to become a cardinal or a pope unless they're involved in these arcane ninth circle rituals and these other satanic practices, which we've documented thoroughly. But this guy in particular is interesting because as a missionary and a bishop in Peru, he was very closely tied to somebody else I'm going to talk about. His name's William Auth. He's a child trafficking priest based out of Michigan. As a matter of fact, these guys were educated and worked just down the road from each other. The present Leo, or you can call him Big Bob if you like, whatever you want, but Robert Prevost, the guy who was just put in, did his education in Holland, Michigan, which is just down the road from Lansing, Michigan, where this William Auth, who's on the screen, did all of his work. Now, this guy you're looking at, William Auth, he's posing with a Mayan child, and in the description, this is a part of a Facebook thing he sent out a number of years ago. He said, here is, this boy is not my latest lover, but he's a good kid. So he's referring openly to all the little child lovers he has in the Mayan communities in Guatemala, Mexico. Now, the present guy who's in, Prevost, was very tied into child trafficking efforts all up and down the Pacific coast in Central America, like with this guy, and in Latin America, South America. And the other interesting thing that ties this guy in is that he's very close to what's called the RBI, which in America in baseball is called runs batted in, but RBI actually means the Road and Belt Initiative. He was the bishop of a place called Chiclayo, which is in northern Peru. It's just down the road from the major port of Chinque, which is where all of the Chinese, it's kind of like the equivalent of what's happening on the west coast of British Columbia. China is going into South America in a huge way to grab all other mining and resources. And the port through which they're operating the port of Chancay, is connected to this guy's diocese. And in fact, when I was talking to our network in South America, in Chile especially, and they've got a big file on this guy, and he was notorious for helping do what the Chinese are doing now in British Columbia, forcing Native people off their land, handing over mining concessions to the Chinese, making agreements with the Peruvian government to allow China to go in a big way to grab a lot of especially the mining resources in South America. So, I mean, this guy is kind of like another person who's in with child trafficking, with the Chinese resources, almost a photocopy of Bergoglio, right?
Yeah, and one of the viewers has asked here that was he supposed to have ignored complaints about a priest who was hurting children, or has that happened multiple times, perhaps?
Well, that's the policy, of course, in the Catholic Church. You're supposed to ignore it. You're supposed to bury the evidence. Everyone is silenced by the policy of crimen. They're all expected to protect child rapists and silence eyewitnesses. That's like the norm. So in terms of his particular incidents, though, yeah, like I say, in the last day, our common law court in Chile has been gathering information on this guy. And we're going to have more specific dirt on him and the role he's played. But as part of his role of bishop, when he was appointed quickly by Bergoglio as cardinal, don't forget, he was appointed cardinal in 2023, soon after Bergoglio and Pietro Parolin, the power in the Vatican, they signed that deal with the Chinese to allow Vatican Bank underwriting for the Chinese expansion, not only into North America, but South America. The whole Pacific Rim, the whole west coast of the Western Hemisphere is now being sucked dry by the Chinese. The resources, like I said, this Road and Belt Initiative, building roads all through the Amazon, to grab the resources. That's what these guys are doing now. And so he's appointed cardinal very quickly. It's kind of like that's why I asked you to put up the picture of Pope Leo from the Middle Ages, because it's like in the Middle Ages, the big families like the Medicis and the Borgias would get their son appointed as a priest and then rapidly become a cardinal and then become the Pope. This is what's happened with this guy. Prevost, Leo XIV now, is in like that into the Vatican. And the position he was appointed to by Bergoglio was basically he gets to appoint, in any diocese, he gets to appoint and supervise the priests. Now, if you're involved in the child trafficking, that's the position you want to be in, because you can detect child trafficking quickly, silence the witnesses, and protect the priests. So again, he's strategically placed to help facilitate this child trafficking. And in terms of this guy on the screen, Leo X, he's one of the guys who made the Reformation happen. He was the guy who excommunicated Martin Luther. He was notoriously corrupt. And he was the first pope in history ever to be described as a child rapist. It's very interesting. There's Martin Luther right there. It was because of Leo's intransigence that the Lutheran and then the other Protestant churches were able to break off, because he was simply a puppet of the Medici family to keep absolute Vatican control over things. Well, the analogy today is quite similar. You got the two big families. You got China and America and Russia, all as kind of the equivalent of the Borgias and the Medicis, controlling the situation. They put their man in, and it's kind of like history repeating itself. And I don't think it's accidental that these guys choose their names for that reason, right?
So Linda's asking whether we know the sexual orientation of the new pope.
Not at this point, but it wouldn't surprise me anything, especially since he's friends with William Auth. I should talk a little bit more about that. He and Auth knew each other. They're friends. Now, this guy, William Auth, is not only a suspected, but he was convicted of child rape in America and then took off for Guatemala. The Vatican never, and the Catholic Church protected him like they always do. He's living now in Guatemala, raping and trafficking children through this thing called Mayan Missions Incorporated. And we have a whole dossier on this guy. But he was associated with the present Pope at this St. Augustine College, where this guy got a seminary theology degree. They both worked out of the same college for a while, and they were friends. We know that from the people in Chile. They've documented this. And I should add about the Chileans, the reason that Bergoglio was very concerned about protecting this new guy is because back, I don't know if you remember this, in 2017, Bergoglio went to Chile and 22 Catholic churches were burned down just before his arrival by the Mapuche Indians, because the Mapuche Indians' children were being trafficked by guys like this William Oth and protected by the church. And they burned down the churches because that's where the children were being trafficked out of, and where the land deeds were, because the church would go in, like we've talked about, and grabbed all the indigenous land to get the resources for China. Well, when Bergoglio, Pope Francis, went to Santiago, Chile, he couldn't get out of the diocesan palace because he was besieged by thousands of demonstrators who wouldn't let him out. The whole place was in an uproar about his visit. So I just think it's not accidental that they would then put in somebody out of the same milieu to try to keep the lid on things, you know, and to make Americans think, and this is a whole other piece, Americans now think, oh, the first American Pope, I guess we have more of an interest now in the Vatican. Well, that certainly serves the Vatican's interest because they want to get America on board as they shift towards China. It's a subtle psychological technique to dampen the criticism of the Vatican just as they're, you know, channeling things to Beijing.
Okay, we're getting close to the threshold of using certain words, Kevin, and YouTube might suppress the video. So from now on, instead of saying trafficking, can we say transporting? And instead of saying the R thing, can we just say the R word? Instead of saying, you know, what they do to these kids, the R-ing of them. Because we don't want YouTube to shut the video down. All right, so the next question is, why are these guys so brazen as to take pictures with kids like this guy on the screen?
Because they know they got away with it. Because they know it's not, you know, a crime to do that to a child. It's standard Vatican policy to protect, you know, people who rape children, violate children. So it's not unusual. It's just, it doesn't surprise me at all that a picture like that would appear. What's significant is the fact that he's tied now. We've already got strong evidence out there quickly that this present Pope is tied into these networks. And, you know, with the present or the previous figurehead Bergoglio, right?
So a lot of people are asking about Trump, right, and, you know, what role, if any, has Donald Trump played in the election of this new Pope?
Well, if you remember a few weeks back, Trump dressed up like the Pope on his little site and said he wanted to be the Pope, you know, being the usual kind of dumbass remark. But he was backing a guy called Timothy Dolan. He wanted an American Pope, and he said that all along. Timothy Dolan is a cardinal closely tied with Trump international banking interests. So that's one of the reasons Trump wanted him in. He does not like this guy because he wasn't in his immediate little sphere of control. But when you think about it, it helps him in his whole relationship with the Vatican, because now he probably thinks he has more leverage having an apparent American into that position of authority. And, you know, I mean, it's always a question of Trump has never done anything that doesn't profit him personally. You know, like, for example, the private prison network that's expanding now because his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is a former lobbyist for the present private prison corporations. A lot of the people apparently being deported are in fact going into these private prisons. Trump International is in trouble financially, and he needs the resources of the Vatican Bank. So naturally he wants an American in there. I mean, it often boils down just to that, right?
So you're being asked whether the age of consent in Vatican City is 12?
There is no age of consent because time and again, cardinals and popes have made the remark that rape, you know, doing that, having said, yes, a child is not a crime, it's a sin. So they don't consider the violation of children and any of that stuff, even the more heinous acts against children, to be crimes. Children are born evil, you know, in their doctrine, and with the original sin doctrine. So it's like, you see, these guys, the mentality doesn't change over the centuries. In ancient Roman culture, women and children were not people. They didn't have personalities. They were things, appendages of men. And so that hasn't changed, despite how much, like if you've noticed in the press now, they're making this new guy seem like a humanitarian. In fact, his politics are very on the right wing of the Vatican. He opposes the ordination of women, that whole kind of thing. So, I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. You have to understand what you're dealing with, and then none of this is surprising, right?
All right, so the next question then, is there a doctrinal reason for the violation of the children?
Doctrinal? Like I say, they believe in original sin. That's their doctrine. People are born depraved, and they're only made fully human by getting baptized and being a loyal slave of the Church of Rome. And so, yeah, that's kind of on a doctrinal level, but in reality, we always know the purpose of these things. It's to traumatize people at a young age. That's how you control them. Do you really think that when you see these masses of people adulating this one man, I mean, where does that come from? The need to worship one man. It's certainly not biblical. In fact, it's interesting because when Jesus in Luke chapter 4, when he was tempted in the wilderness by the devil says to him, Satan says, I will give you all the power of the world. Just worship me. And when you look in my book, Dethrone the Rogue Power, right at the back, we have quotes from various popes. Pope John Paul II in 1996. Have no fear when men call me Christ on earth, for I am he. Pope Francis, Christ made himself sin. You need not go to Christ for salvation, come to me. That's the name of the Pope, Christ Vicari Christi, the one who replaces Christ. So when you say, are they satanic? Yes, they're worshiping Satan, the power, the God of this world, rather than God and Christ, who said, my kingdom isn't of this world. So how can people all do that? Massive brainwashing at a young age. Every government, every corporate power in the world needs that. That's how you keep a population in line. I think that's the real reason, frankly.
You're getting asked if you can expand on the case of Cardinal Pell, a former altar boy who had been violated, apparently ended his life. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, he was the Australian Cardinal, Pell. And Australia is, again, a bad area for this. The thing to understand is that these crimes against children happen, they follow the money. And so Australia, like Canada, is right on the front line of the Chinese expansion to grab resources and everything. And one of our people in Australia, Virginia Cameron, was murdered after she went in by herself, age 69, into a church and began to read the doctrine of crimen solicitatis. I mean, they kill their opposition there. And they get very upset when their crimes against children are exposed. The thing about Cardinal Pell is he was one of the chief advisors to the Vatican Bank. And he was part of a faction fight between the Ratzinger and Bergoglio factions that put in Bergoglio. And he came out on the losing end. But in the course of investigating him, there were a number of eyewitnesses who died quickly, including children or former children who came forward to describe him raping them, R-ing them, if you like, whatever you want to do. However you want to describe it, violating children. And so, yeah, it's all connected to that. You know, it's kind of like, again, like I mentioned the other day, describing scales of the dragon or looking at the whole beast. Once you know the nature of the beast, these things are explainable, right?
So Anna wants to know if it's part of the satanic belief system to feed off the energy while violating children, taking the energy from the children.
Yeah, definitely. It's energetic vampirism. And it happens at a spiritual level, but psychologically as well. It's a technique as we, in terms of controlling people and inducting them into the cult, because one of the things that happens in these satanic cults is that they're intergenerational. So families belong to them, prominent Catholic families especially. And they are, the first child is usually sacrificed. The other children are trained to do the same thing to their children. So for example, Toos Nijenhuis, the Dutch woman who first introduced us into the Ninth Circle, into awareness of it, she said that her eldest sister was brutally raped and murdered by their own father, and then she was elevated into the cult. And she claims to have witnessed the manifestation of what she thought was Satan. It could have been some dark entity that was literally feeding off the energy of these children as they were being brutalized and killed. I witnessed it myself. I mean, I've had experiences of that in Vancouver, which I can describe, which were kind of bizarre, but it involves energy, or whatever word you want to use to describe that, feeding off our energy. And I think that's true for us as a whole society too, where we are systematically fed off energetically and mentally by this system, right?
So Pam's asking, where are the parents of these kids? And Pam, when I watched the documentary about the Irish priest who was getting moved around America, it was like these families trusted the church so much. They just left the priest in the room with their kid to do whatever he wanted over and over again. So, in response to where are the parents, Kevin, is it a case of the parents just think these guys, are, representatives of God, and it's beyond their belief systems that they're doing these satanic things to them?
Well, when the Catholic Church says God, they're referring to Satan, their God, the God of the world. And people are deeply afraid of that. And I know because I've talked to parents. These are indigenous parents. And I asked them that. And they said, when you saw your children being dragged away and even raped in front of you by these priests, why didn't you do anything? And they said, we were scared. We knew that we'd be arrested and it would happen to us too. And it's at that level of fear. But there is, like you say, a degree of brainwashing that, well, I guess they know better than us. If you're raised with the idea that there's something wrong with a newborn child, that children have to be, and this isn't just the Catholic Church, the whole European tradition of pedagogy, of educating children is the stubbornness of a child has to be beaten out of them, either physically or mentally or in other ways, and they have to be made to conform. That's kind of intrinsic to the whole Judeo-Christian culture. This Catholicism is maybe the worst manifestation of it, but I mean, it's part of the same mindset when it comes to do with children. That's why indigenous children who never had that were crushed so quickly, because and their parents were totally trusting about everyone. They didn't think that people would do this to their own children. So I think it's a sign of the sickness of our culture that goes back many centuries, right?
Yeah, I was an altar boy, and I, was left with priests. Fortunately, nothing happened to me like this, but sadly, the Catholic Church has become one of the biggest rings in the world for these monsters. And it's, thanks to Kevin, who's at the forefront of exposing this, that we can see the other side, and we can hopefully alert people so they can protect the kids and don't leave them in the clutches of these people. All right, so you touched on the ninth circle earlier and the new pope. Could you expand on that, please, Kevin, and just explain to people again what the ninth circle is?
Well, it's originally a European-based child sacrifice. It's a sacrificial cult, closely mirroring the Catholic Mass. Catholics believe that the priest transforms the communion elements into the literal body and blood of Christ. You're eating Christ's flesh and drinking his blood. Not like a Protestant who believes they're just symbols. But a Catholic says, no, that's literally Christ you're eating. Now, it's a cannibalistic cult in that sense, wrapped in religion to make people more palatable to people. But in the ninth circle, it's a copy and a reflection of the Catholic Mass, where it says, the innocents, the blood and the body of the innocents, the innocent children, a newborn baby especially, will redeem you. And that's why they cannibalize the child or the newborn after they do it. Now, there's a satanic element in that as well, because they use it as a means to control people. It's believed that the Jesuits set it up in the 1500s. The Jesuits were set up as an army, secret army of the Pope, to kill any Protestant king in Europe. Their first job was to kill Queen Elizabeth in England in the 1500s. The ones who invited my family as Huguenots from France gave us sanctuary. I wouldn't be here right now. But it was the Jesuits set it up, as a way to control kings, politicians, judges. Eventually, they invite them to these rituals and then trap them, film them, entrap them, and then use them that way. Anne-Marie van Bienberg, a lawyer in Belgium, described how that happened to her, and how she witnessed all these things. So, yeah, I mean, it's all that playing itself over and over, right?
I remember watching that movie about Queen Elizabeth I, where various people were trying to kill her. So what was the reason they were trying to kill her?
I forget which papal bull it was, but whatever pope it was back then, basically said Elizabeth is a heretic. She, like her father, she brought in the Protestant religion in England, and she was a sanctuary. It was the only power in England at the time. It was the only place you could go and have sanctuary as a Protestant. And remember the Spanish Armada? They tried to overthrow her, and then it got destroyed by the weather. So I mean, it was power politics back then, between Spain and the Vatican trying to overthrow the one Protestant power that was resisting them, along with Holland. So it was that, and it was also, you had to rub out a bad example, right?
Yeah. Is the new Pope Jesuit?
Not apparently. He's part of what's called the Augustinians, and they were a missionary society that operated all over South America, and all over the world, really. And whenever you find missionaries, you see mass murder. Just follow the history of it, and you'll see it.
If Jesuits have been banned from being popes for hundreds of years, is the timeline of the last pope being manipulated?
That's a good question. I don't know. They keep saying this is the last pope. No, this is the last pope. I don't know. That could just be distraction that was put out there. But definitely it's a rule within the Jesuits that, they can never become pope, which led people to question whether, in fact, Bergoglio was, the pope at all. And so, it's open to speculation.
So Leo the 14th, why did he pick that name?
I think, it's funny. The Vatican over the centuries has learned to send in subtle little clues all the time, as if to tease people, to say, hey, look what we're getting away with. That's certainly the mentality of fairly high up church people I've interviewed. And Leo, as I said, was kind of a bulwark against the Reformation. He was extreme conservative, first one to be accused of raping children. There were stories at the time circulating that Leo the 10th would invite children into his private quarters in the Vatican, then they would never be seen again. That's the first time in history that it had ever been referred to. And again, I think it could be just a little reference to the present guy. Why would he pick the name Leo? I mean, it's speculative right at this point, but we'll have more information once we get digging more into his personal background. Because don't forget, people like this, there's false biographies put out all the time to shield who they really were and everything. The only way we get the real story is by people in the church or people he's worked with. And that's why this connection he has with this William Auth and the child trafficking and the activities of the church involving,
transportation.
Okay. Why it's so crucial to keep pushing in that area of investigating, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And this is a global network, and it's one of the more lucrative networks in the world. So we'll see.
So Tony saying, if we are all equal in the sight of God, why is there so much hierarchy in the church?
Because they don't reflect the natural order, natural law, or God. They reflect like I say in my book, it's a cult of emperor worship. It has nothing to do with Christ. They've monopolized the rhetoric and the appearance of Christianity. It's not a Christian religion. It's based on emperor worship from the late Roman Empire. And in the Roman system, there's no such thing as equality. It was based on hierarchies. You didn't have an identity. There's no name in Latin for the word I. You were an extension of something or someone else. People refer to, the capitalized letters in your ID. That came from the Roman, it refers to a piece of property or a slave. capitis diminutia maxima. It means you are an object that we can manipulate. So the Roman Church has never, it's been the main force in history against equality. John Adams, the second American president, said, if the Roman Catholic Church ever achieves power in America, the republic is over, because liberty and popery are opposed. Two totally different notions, you know, and that's why the Chinese and them get along so well, because they have the same notion of emperor worship. You know, one guy in charge, the corporatist system, the whole global system is based on that now, of rule by one man and or one authority, and so yeah, it's like asking, why doesn't a lion become a vegetarian, right?
Okay, what does his election indicate about the future of the papacy?
I think it indicates more that the move towards China is increasing quickly. I mentioned in the last interview how in China, it's the only country in the world where the government and the Catholic Church work together to appoint bishops and cardinals to determine what the public actions and statements of the church. It's like fused. And I think the same thing could very easily happen in America now. I think you're seeing a convergence happening all over the planet where big money, the state and the church merge into one body. Now, traditionally, that's how genocide operates, that unholy triangle, big money, church, and state. Now it's globalized. And so I think it wouldn't surprise me, just like I'll be surprised if there's ever another US election. But it wouldn't surprise me if you have the same development in America, where the American Pope here announces, well, we've come to an agreement with the Trump administration as to how the church should be operating. Trump himself has said he'd like to see that. Bergoglio, Pope Francis, was continually referring to the need for a one world government and pushing big pharma stuff and everything. So I think that's the convergence. We're seeing this convergence of all the power into one big super corporation. And the Vatican is at the head of that because they're the main financial power in the world, right?
This is interesting. So in China, the majority of the population either identifies as having no religion or follows Chinese folk religions. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam have significant followings, although to a lesser extent. Christianity, including both Protestant and Catholic denominations, is followed by around 5 to 7% of the population. When the population is that big, that's still a hell of a lot of people, isn't it, Kevin?
That's what I'm talking about. It's proof. If there were more Catholics in China, it would make sense. But if they're only 5% of the population or less, how come the Chinese government is the only country in the world to work with the Vatican? Well, because it's not about religion. The religion, just politics and religion are for the masses. It's to keep people deluded that, you know, there's such a thing as honesty in government, justice, rule of law. It's about money. It's about power of a few over the many. And the best system to achieve that is a corporatocracy, the hierarchy that we've been talking about. The Vatican and the Maoist system of, you could call it state capitalism, or the merger of you know, money and power into one state system, they perfected it. They're bosom buddies. They see the world in the same way. So it's a prototype. It's like what China is doing with the Vatican is like a forerunner to the way the whole world's going to be. And that's why it's important to follow this stuff, because it's like the canary in the mine shaft. What you see going on now with this stuff is going to be the future of the world unless we stop it with an alternative. And that's what we're trying to create on the ground now with the sovereign republics.
So we've got 1,500 watching live across all platforms presently. Kevin's absolutely on fire tonight. He's come on very short notice because we've got this new Pope. If you've got any questions, folks, put them in the chat and keep them on point so we can keep Kevin going for some longer. And also all of Kevin's links, books, etc. are in the description box if you are watching this on YouTube. And Kevin really appreciates all the people who've got his book recently and have been in touch and are enjoying it, because there's far more details in the books. But it's terrifying stuff what we're hearing here this evening, this inversion. And you know, we were talking about world politics as well. So with China then, Are you saying that the Chinese are co-opting, or is it the other way around? The Catholics are co-opting the Chinese?
I think each think they're doing it to the other, but the reality is, if you follow the money, the Vatican holds the financial power. And speaking of that, remember when J.D. Vance went to Rome?
Yeah.
One of our sources in Washington said it was to take a bribe to put Timothy Dolan in as Pope. Bribe not just financially, but which is funny, it's kind of hard to bribe the biggest financial power in the world. But it wasn't that kind of bribe. It was giving concessions to the Catholic Church in America, along the lines of what I was saying previously. And yeah, so I mean, I think it's that. Repeat your question. Sorry, I got off on this tangent.
Yeah, we were asking about the co-opting of the Vatican by China and vice versa.
Right. So it's the financial pull of the Vatican is one source of power, but the fact that the world's population and economic engine is now in the East gives China the authority. It's why it's going to be the superpower within less than 30 years, militarily and every other way. I think Trump's on board with that. I think that's one of the reasons he's deliberately gutting the country and feeding the conflict, because it's the best way to dissolve America in the face of China's buying up of it. So I think you have a convergence of interests, and so they're in the final analysis, they're all on the same team, but how they go about it is different. You got to maintain the appearance with your own group, your own flock, so as not to alienate them too much. So it's done in stages, right? It's like the frog boiling in the water gradually, right?
So IHS on Pope Leo's robes when he was presented to the world. Do we know what that means?
IHS? Yeah, it's Latin. It means, well, there's different ideas of what it means. In seminary, I was taught it means, it's Latin for Jesus, Savior, and something. I can't remember. It's supposed to be a Latin designation. But don't forget, a lot of those Latin designations are from the Roman Empire. And like there's a thing that looks like a P with kind of an X through it. Laburnum, it's called. It was a military symbol from the Roman cavalry. All of these military symbols and everything went right into the Vatican. That's why I say it's a continuance of the Roman Empire, literally, in every way, including how people see the Pope.
Yeah, I'm looking. They say there's an estimate of the Vatican's global wealth could reach $265 billion US. Do you think that's accurate, or is that underestimate?
That's a pittance, because don't forget, calculate about 3/4 of the world's bank deposits go into the Vatican Bank or its partner, the Bank of International Settlements in Geneva. And a lot of the offshore accounts and everything, the financial concordats, where a certain percentage of tax money from over 100 countries is channeled right into the Vatican Bank without taxpayers or politicians even knowing it or colluding quietly. All the collection money brought in, all their corporate investments, it's in the trillions, but of course they've got to keep fiddling the figures. It's like in Canada, when the government keeps changing the figures about how many children died in the rescues, when it was over 50%. Some days they'll say it was 3%. Some days they'll say it was 5%, maybe even a bit more. It depends, you rewrite history every 5 minutes, like George Orwell says, to keep everybody confused, right?
Yeah, because the last estimate of Chinese GDP is $18 trillion US in 2023. We've got US at 27 trillion, but China is expected to overtake America, isn't it, in the coming years?
I think, well, it already has in terms of like GDP and things like that. America's where Britain was after World War II. It's rapidly going down the toilet, and China's where America was. It's the rising power. But yeah, it's how can the Vatican not be bloated with wealth, considering its situation, right?
Indeed. James wants to know, what is the best book to buy by Kevin, which focuses on Catholic corruption?
Well, of course, this is the most recent one. It goes into all the hard facts. But all throughout my other works, I continually refer to this stuff. If you go to murderbydecree.com, that's my book, which is also on Amazon, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada. We had to put it online because it kept disappearing from libraries all the time, destroyed. But in that Murder by Decree, you have concrete evidence of how the Catholic Church operated in Canada to commit genocide, to do all these other crimes against children. And then you can get a lot of hard details. But start with that for sure. And like I say, contact me at that email and on the site Sean has posted. And I can feed you a lot more information on the ground of things we're learning all the time.
So that book there that you've got, Dethroning, is there a summary on the back of the cover that you could read to us?
The Vatican Incorporated and the Church of Rome is a criminally convicted corporation that has killed more people than any institution in human history. Yet it is treated as a legitimate nation and offers the protection of the law and diplomacy in many countries and at the United Nations, despite its disqualification as a bona fide or lawful power. This book makes the argument for denying the Vatican any presence or membership of the United Nations, backed with the hard evidence of its crimes and illegitimacy. And like, to give you an example, a transnational criminal organization is a criminal body of 3 or more people that traffics human beings, launders money for crime, traffics in arms, and migrant workers. If you do any of those things, well, the Vatican does at least 3 and probably 4 of them. So under law, it's a TNCO. It's a transnational criminal body. Doesn't have the right to operate. And as citizens, you're not only allowed to, but you're expected to not cooperate with that, i.e. not give them money, and seize their property and wealth as reparations. You see, any money you give to the Catholic Church is funding a criminal body. And so you're committing a crime against humanity by doing that. So are all the governments. The point is, when everybody's in bed with the criminal, you look like there's something wrong with you when you say no, right? And you become the problem, as I experienced personally, and so do a lot of other people on the ground who take on this thing. So we have to know your enemy, otherwise you can't fight it. Otherwise you're in its bailiwick, and there's no way to stop any of these things.
So Kevin, with the previous Pope pretending he was for peace and saying people shouldn't invest in, arms manufacturers, etc., how does that compare to the present Pope? Is he going down that PR route as well, or does he not give a hoot?
Oh, he'll have to go down the same PR route because it's a blatant lie. That's why I know, when you talk about, are they Satanists? How is Satan described in the Bible? The father of lies. Every time these guys open their mouth, they lie. They have to, because the Vatican is one of the biggest arms dealers. When you look at its investments, it owns the biggest small arms company in the world, Beretta Limited. It's for missile systems, guidance systems. They're heavily invested at every level. And Bergoglio could make that statement because everybody knows that it didn't mean anything in practice, because the Pope's just a figurehead. The College of Cardinals isn't going to come on and say that shit, but their guy, their figurehead, the hand puppet, can say that without any consequence. The present guy will do, if anything, he'll make even more ludicrous remarks, because you see, he has to follow what I believe is the agenda, and that's bring America into the Chinese camp. And, so I mean, that's the big purpose. But again, there's all the other things that the Bishop of Rome was expected to do to keep their investments going, right?
Paul wants to know whether the Vatican is invested in gene editing and big pharma.
Yes, in a big way. It's one of its chief investment portfolios involves big pharma. Not only the genetic GMO stuff and all that, but they were in the forefront of testing drugs. When people talk about the COVID drugs and the nanoparticle stuff and the bioweaponry, that was pioneered by, to give you an example that we know best, in the Indian hospitals in Canada as early as the 1950s. Expatriate Nazi scientists, and sponsored by the Vatican, brought out through the rat lines. The future Pope Paul VI was the guy who arranged the rat lines and brought the Nazi scientists into North America and South America. they're in the forefront of developing a lot of those drugs. So, I mean, they're almost synonymous with big pharma when you look at where their money goes.
Question from Lakey. Do you think there's any overlap between the Vatican's handling of clergy abuse under Leo XIV and the systemic cover-ups you've discussed with the royals, or is the Vatican a separate entity?
No, they're not separate at all. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an example of that. Just before I was deported from England in 2011, I had spoken at Trafalgar Square at a big rally. It was a protest the Pope March. We had 20,000 people in the street to protest when Ratzinger came to England. He met with Queen Elizabeth. It was called the Holyrood Agreement. And it was an agreement whereby Elizabeth violated her coronation oath by negotiating the return of the Church of England into the Church of Rome. She should have been bounced on the spot if England followed its own constitutional law. But what that did was it merged the policies. So by the Crimin policy in the Catholic Church, where everyone is silenced, the police are not told, and the child whatever is protected, then
violator.
Yeah, okay, fine. That now applies to the Church of England. Every Anglican priest is expected to follow it too. So they're not separate bodies at all. In a way, they never were, because in Rome they think the Pope is the head of the Church. In England, the king is, but in reality, Christ is to a Christian. So, I mean, they're both variations on the same theme, right?
So PM wants to know, is something cooking with this new Pope and Opus Dei? Can you explain to people what Opus Dei is first?
Yeah, it means the works of God, which is funny. They mean the works of Satan. But it was a secret cult, a militaristic cult that started 19th century, mid-19th century, I believe. And they're behind a lot of the military dictatorships around the world. You often see Opus Dei members. When Bergoglio was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was friends with the guy who set up the death squads, Jose Lopez Rega, who was an Opus Dei member. They went around and killed anybody who the military junta didn't like. They would take priests and nuns, throw them out of helicopters into the ocean. Well, Bergoglio stood by and did a PR job for the military junta. Well, that was all Opus Dei stuff. I believe most of the generals were members of Opus Dei. They were big in Spain under the Franco dictatorship. So they're also a financial force like the Jesuits. You'll see them in, heavily involved in American banks like Citibank, HSBC, those banks. So, kind of one of the other manifestations of the Satanism we're talking about, right?
So Luke wants to know, is the Pope not only the head of the Roman Catholic institution, but also a sovereign king over a nation state?
No. Nation states, there's 4 definitions of what a nation state is under the Montevideo Convention of 1933, international law. The Vatican satisfies none of those definitions. They don't have a stable population. They don't have a military power to defend their borders. They don't have border checks or passports, any of that stuff defining a nation. The ability to enter into treaties, they don't. And so they're not a nation state. And it's a fiction. It's what Geoffrey Robertson, he's a Queen's Counsel in England, wrote a good book called The Case of the Pope. And he tears apart the whole argument that they're even any kind of nation state. He calls them a Santa Claus state. A Santa Claus state is something everybody pretends exists for the sake of politics and power. But in fact, they have no authority, spiritual or temporal. It's just a big fiction. And so this whole notion that he's some kind of absolute dictator, he has no authority. That's why when we convicted Ratzinger and forced him out of office, that's why he hid in the Vatican till the day he died, because he knew he has no power. As soon as he steps out of their little club, he could be arrested, including by citizens who exercise citizen arrest power. So, I mean, we've got to really cut through that fiction. And in fact, I go into detail on that in the Dethroning book.
Ray J wants to know whether you, Kevin, have any plans for a case against Leo.
Well, it wouldn't be me. It would be the International Common Court of Justice. But it's a standing court, which means, you see, the thing to understand, he's the CEO officially of Vatican Incorporated. he is automatically guilty by being in the position because the Vatican is already a criminally convicted power. It's like, would Hitler's successor have been put on trial in Nuremberg? Yes, because he was part of a criminal state. Similarly here, he's automatically investigated, and depending on the dirt that comes up about him and the ability to bring a successful prosecution against him, that'll determine it. But I mean, the real issue here is he's already been found guilty by being associated with that thing. It's not a matter of information and more cases now. It's a matter of enforcement. How are we going to make the arrest? You have the power to do that. Like I said earlier, you can occupy any Catholic church, seize its property as reparations. I go into detail in that in the Common Law Training Manual book I have about how to actually go about setting up that prosecution. But the real test is in your own community. You know, every Catholic priest is involved in child trafficking. It's up to the people in your community whether you want that to happen or not, right?
So Tashel wants to know whether the new Pope is pretty much part of the club, or is he a free thinker?
You can't be a free thinker and become the Bishop of Rome. If you tried something outside the agenda, you end up dead after 28 days, like Pope John Paul I in 1978. Right? So, I mean, if he did have a little thing of conscience in there somewhere, it would either be crushed right away, or he might be found dead, or he'll just go along and play the ball. But by definition, in any hierarchy, people of conscience don't last long. That's not how you rule, by having a conscience. You have to suppress that in order to rule. That's why we often say people at the pinnacle of any system are the craziest, the most dissociated, because they're not allowed to be who they are and to be free thinkers. And that's proven all the time, right? Just look around.
So what specific traits does Leo have that made them select him, in your opinion?
Well, a number of theories. It could be the fact that Bergoglio had been maneuvering to have him as the successor. I mean, don't forget, this guy went from a bishop to a cardinal like that about not even 2 years ago. Just put in. And when Bergoglio had signed the deal with China and when his own health was failing, this guy becomes a cardinal. So it could be an arranged thing from Bergoglio's end. But it could also be an agreement with, when you want a change to happen, you don't pick anyone obvious. If they had picked a Chinese cardinal, it would have been obvious. Well, that's China manipulating things. You bring somebody who's totally unknown out of left field, and nobody knows anything about him, and he's free to do whatever the hell he wants. And that's politically how people like this come in. The very fact that he's unknown means he's got a lot of dirt on him and a lot of associations that they didn't want you to know about. So that could be another factor too, but ultimately comes down to the geopolitics. What's going on between America and China? Why do you put an American in now? Because for obvious public relations reasons and to woo American Catholics into the Vatican camp. And I think that that's kind of self-evident. Right?
So even mainstream was putting out some articles about him, his reputation being marred by his attitude towards the priests that were busted violating the kids. Do you think that attitude worked in his favor to get him elected?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, don't forget, he's tied in directly with these networks we talked about through William Mouth and the Mayan network in South America. Imagine what goes on in Canada brought down to South America. That's kind of the equivalent of what he represents. So naturally, he's got to protect his friends. He's not going to rat out these guys who are doing these things to children. And he's kind of proved that. That was the credentials. He had to prove that he had the right stuff to enforce crimin policy and to keep the whole thing hidden. And I think that's what he's doing, right?
And in the poorer countries of the world, is it easier for these priests to get away with these violations against kids?
Absolutely. It's if you think it's easy in a place like England or America, where the law is on their side to do whatever they want to children, you know, in a war-torn area or a poverty-stricken area, I learned this when I was in Guatemala and Mexico. It's open season, you know, and parents sell their own children to survive. I mean, that's why they're so. I think that's why the Church of Rome is so big in Asia and Africa and South America, because they can prey on people there more effectively, right? And you know, there was an interesting study done as in Mexico, as people became more affluent, they went to church less. But the people who are in the Catholic churches are always the poorest. You see this, the poorest people are going to the Catholic Church because there's nothing in your life to believe in. You got to believe in this fanciful, tale you're given that if you play along, you'll go to heaven if you play in our club. And as people gain ability to support themselves, the fear goes away. And fear and religion, and I think they've proven this in studies, the same part of the brain responsible for fear and aggression, it's also tied into the religious impulse, right? The kind of the ecstatic desire to believe in that. And it's not accidental, it's a fear-based system, religion, right?
Good grief, Kevin. My baby Ziggy here, he's not even 2 years old yet. And what you said there about parents just selling the kids up, giving the kids up to the church, babies. Oh, that just made me feel absolutely sick. Are these parents just naive, idealistic, have faith in the church, or do they know what's going to happen to these kids?
Oh, they know. I mean, everybody knows. But if you're going to be able to feed 3 of your kids by giving up one of them, what are people going to do? I mean, the choices of the destitute are something it's hard to understand unless you're there, and yet that's just fed off, of course.
That's really upset me. All right, so Lakey says, Pope Francis's death on Easter Monday, was it faked or timed by the Vatican for symbolic reasons?
It's a big show. It's always designed for a psychological impact, right? Why was he named after Francis of Assisi in the first place, right? I mean, we had to clean up Ratzinger's mess, so we got to bring in a saintly guy who was, it's just so obvious that all we have to use is our common sense, and we can see through these lies, right?
Yeah, and I just want to thank the viewers for keeping all the questions on point tonight. The questions just got so weird last time.
It was fun, but
we've got almost 2,000 people watching live right now, and Ray J wants to know, and please keep your questions coming, folks. Ray J wants to know, what does Kevin think the next few years will show or hide?
Personally, I was reflecting on this morning, and I think we're at a point in history like the Reformation. You're seeing a lot of corrupt stuff, but something new is emerging from within it. It always does. It's like the law of nature is anything that appears in one way, its opposite appears at the same time. And we're seeing all over the world this thing I talk about, right? Sovereignty, spiritual, personal, political sovereignty. And that means we're going to see more and more of a opposition and also breaking away happening in the Church of Rome. Like they always portray themselves as this unitary monolith. It isn't. It's breaking up all over the world. I worked with a group of Catholic priests in Ireland called Not in Our Name, and they had all split off. You don't hear from them because the media censored out all this stuff. The Vatican owns a lot of the media, but they had said, okay, we're going to just be our own congregations. We're not going to have anything to do with Rome because of its corruption and crimes and everything. We're just going to go our own way. And you're going to see that. You see that happening all over now. And you're going to see more of that. It's going to get worse and better all at the same time. And we then have a choice. It's a good time because then people more and more are going to have to make a choice. Where do you stand, right? And, that happens, like I say, in your own family, in your own community, but also right here. You're going to make a choice right here. Once you know the truth, are you going to serve the evil anymore or get on board with the new rising alternative that I hope in some way our work embodies? And, so that's why I say, look at the bigger picture and stay strong. We wouldn't have survived all these centuries of corruption and murder unless we had an innate goodness and reason in all of us. And that's what we have to appeal to more and more,
Let me respond to this one. So M is saying, I am a Catholic. Please stop the bashing. I am a Catholic as well. I was an altar boy, raised Catholic. My grandparents are very religious when I was a child. My sister turned her bedroom into a shrine, like an altar, with all of her religious artifacts. And we're not bashing. There's good and bad in every institution. And to protect kids, we've got to shine a light on the bad. And it's a fact that the Catholic Church houses one of the biggest rings in the world of adults who violate kids. It's a fact.
It's a
and
policy.
if you've looked at the criminal cases, these priests, the Catholic Church brings in these fancy lawyers. They just move the priests around to different jurisdictions or different countries to avoid prosecution, and they end up with hundreds and hundreds of victims. It's absolutely disgusting.
Well, it's
so
and I would say to the person who wrote that, no, I do not respect a faith that is involved in these crimes and that violates and denies Scripture and the lives of children all the time, and then persecutes people who try to expose it. That's nothing to be respectful of. You can have whatever faith you want as long as it doesn't harm another human being. And I don't understand why that's so difficult to get. And I don't understand how people who know that can put money in a collection plate and directly fund these child killers. So that's something you have to ask in your own conscience. And whatever that has to do with Jesus, you tell me, because I don't see any connection.
Just think that money going into that plate could be paying for a fancy lawyer to come and protect one of these child violators so they can just get a slap on the wrist and commit more crimes. It's absolutely disgusting. And unless we shine a light on this, there's just going to be more and more victims, and it's got to stop. So Chris wants to know, what are the daily, day-to-day responsibilities and duties of the Pope?
He's a figurehead, so there aren't necessarily any duties. I know this from priests and other people I spoke to in Italy, that essentially he's a showman. So he presides at certain conferences and meetings of the cardinals, okay? He has that administrative role. He does a lot of public relations tours all over the world, so all the slaves can get down and worship him. But I mean, it's essentially a figurehead position. And like I mentioned, the real power in the Rome, in the Vatican, Pietro Parolin, he spends a lot of the time at the center of power, not like this guy. This guy is not at the center of power. And so, that's kind of a short answer.
So Angela wants to know, who are the higher up people that control the Vatican?
Well, spiritually, the father of lies, Satan, I believe. And politically, and in terms of this world, it's their bankers, it's the College of Cardinals, and it's their connections with various governments like China and that. I mean, like we showed in China, it's run by a joint committee of the Chinese government and the Vatican. So, I mean, in a nutshell.
So Franz wants to know if you think this Pope will continue to be involved in moving around and covering up kids, covering up priests who violate kids.
He has to. It's the policy that he do so. Crimen Sila Satanis. Read it. Go to murderbydecree.com. Read in the appendices, one of the appendices there, the entire policy. Every Catholic in the world, not just every clergy and every cardinal and pope, but every Catholic in the world, and this is again addressed to the previous person who objected about us taking on her church, she is expected to enforce crimen, which means if you know of a child being raped, you're not to protect that child, you're to protect the church, not the child, and you can't tell the police. That's a criminal conspiracy. I mean, imagine if the Mafia was doing that. The Mafia is saying, we have a policy that any Italian child raped, we're not to tell the police. They'd be immediately arrested. Well, how come they get to do it? Because they have a cross on their building.
It's crazy that this guy's in plain sight being elected. He's got a history of doing it, and he's probably going to continue to do it. It's like they just don't care. So AE is asking, how do we go about dismantling this corrupt institution?
Well, we outline that actually at the back book of that. Right at the back, we say a plan of action. It happens on different levels. First of all, don't attend. Get your friends not to attend. Don't give money if you do. Join our movement. We have, in 9 countries now, we have campaigns. It's called banishment and reclamation. And it came up an indigenous idea that we just go into the churches, take them over. They've been banished from these 9 countries. And like in the Republic of Canada, we have a policy, the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches aren't allowed to operate on their territory. They're convicted criminal bodies that harm children, harm the community, defraud and steal money from the community. And And so they're not allowed to operate. So you can do that from the grassroots. That's how you deflate a system, right at the grassroots. But also you can make this an issue politically. You can say to your politicians, stop funding, stop giving tax exemptions and any kind of privileges to the Vatican, nullify your diplomatic relation, expel the papal nuncio. It's all described in Dethroning Rogue Power, but also murderbydecree.com. But most importantly, write to us and we can get you involved in that campaign.
Yeah, because you're asking, James is asking, how can he join your movement? So with the links in the description box, people can contact you, can't they?
Angelfire101 at protonmail.com is the best way. And there's other links that Sean has up.
So Claudia wants to know, do you know who the other two papal contenders were?
There are a number of them listed. Pietro Parolin was in there. Yeah, they had to put him in. Just kind of for appearance sake. There was a Chinese fellow, I forget his name, and also Geraldo Lacroix, the Ninth Circle guy in Canada we talked about last time.
Okay, so Hazel wants to know, does the Roman Catholic Church brainwash people from childhood by ritual and repetition?
Yeah, and well, Sean, you could probably answer that better because you were raised in the cult, but I never was. But it's also the underlying fear of damnation, going to hell, and you're incomplete without the sacraments. You know, you're incomplete without us. It's that childhood dependency that they never change, right?
Yeah, and I was educated in Catholic school as well, so that ritual and repetition extended into our assemblies and our religious education classes. And, to this day, I remember all the sitting up, when you got to sit down and stand up and all the different prayers, Our Father, Hail Mary, contrition, confession. And then they tell you to, the contrition, what you've got, how many Our Fathers and Hail Marys you've got to say. So there's a lot of repetition. All right. Tashelle wants to know, where does all the money from the Vatican go?
Oh, well, it goes into places like the international banking cartel are totally integrated with the Vatican Bank. So you could also ask, well, where does all their money go? It goes into the whole financial system. It goes into the military in a big way, all their investments. The problem is we don't know because the Vatican Bank is a completely secret society. You can't audit it. You can't know who the directors are. The only information we've ever gotten is from sources within the Vatican who leak us this information. But it was set up by Mussolini, the fascist dictator, in 1929 to be a closed society. And it's very murky in there, right? And you don't know what they're doing, but we do know that a lot of the world's money is being channeled into it. And, that's something that needs a lot more digging.
Haven't a few people ended up murdered associated with the Vatican Bank?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Roberto Calvi, the Vatican's banker, found hanging under Blackfriar Bridge in London. That happened right at the same time that they killed John Paul I. The Santa Alianza is the name of the Vatican Assassination Espionage Bureau. They killed him. They poisoned him. Anybody who knew John Paul I or worked with him or investigated his death, they were all dead within a year or two, from car bombings, assassinations. So it's all part of that mess, right?
Tashelle, is the Vatican the nucleus or head of all Christian religions and churches?
No, it's not a Christian religion. And it's part of, you see, this thing came out of what was called Vatican II in 1962, this thing called ecumenism, which meant all the world's religions get together. But it's kind of like the chickens getting together with the elephant. What happens? They get stomped, The notion the Vatican has of ecumenism is that there's no power outside Rome. All of you people are false churches. And what distinguishes a Christian church is the belief that Christ is the head of their church, not a man in Rome. It's a fundamental division. That's why every Protestant church in history used to refer to Rome as the Antichrist. None of them do now because they're all getting funded out of it. And what's called the World Council of Churches, which is the Protestant, it's kind of like the Protestant equivalent of the Vatican. It's a federation of all these Protestant churches around the world, but they're just a reflection of the Vatican now. They've been completely co-opted as part of the United Nations to create this one world church, one world government system. And I know that in seminary, you know, when I began to criticize the World Council of Churches, they did not like that any more than later when I described the crimes of genocide against children. So, I mean, it's part of the big cabal. And so it's hard to just to say there are such things as Christian churches anymore. I think they're pretty much integrated into the global corporatocracy, right? That's enunciated in Rome.
So Corey wants to know what we mean when we're saying that the Vatican is satanic.
It reflects the power of this world rather than of God. And I think that should be obvious. I mean, why would God need a cathedral and billions of dollars of money and arms trading and a policy protecting, you know, those who harm children? What does that have to do with God? It should be obvious. It's right in, it's like the elephant in the living room. It's staring at our face. So Satan in the Bible is the one who is the enemy. Satan means adversary, the adversary of God. So, you know, in all faiths, you look at God, it's that they describe it as a spiritual power within us. The kingdom of heaven is within you, not in the church. And Satan represents the adversary of that. And the Church of Rome is, for many reasons you can look at historically, if you read the real histories, you'll see that it's the embodiment of their worldly power. But like Satan, father of lies, it exists behind the lie of piety and co-opting Christ into Christendom, right? And that's a whole history in of itself. And I go into a little bit of that in Dethroning, but I've written some other books on that as well.
I'll just add to that my personal belief is crimes against children are the most evil acts anyone can commit, and any institution that enables, condones, protects perpetrators is not pious. It's an inversion of what it's purporting to be. So Jen wants to know, are you aware of what Italians really think about the Vatican?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in Italy. And as a matter of fact, in the fall, in September, I'm coming back to Europe and giving talks all over. And I'm looking forward to going to Rome. But in northern Italy, there's a whole network of people who are setting up their own common law assemblies. And we're talking to those folks. That's one of the questions I often ask them. Well, how much support does the church have anymore? They say it's a formal kind of support, especially from older people. But like you found in Quebec, in Canada, a lot of people don't go to church anymore. You know, it's like they say 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. That's formal. You know, that's people go to church, as I experienced, on Easter or for baptisms or funerals, but they're not devout. And you don't find that devotion even in Italy anymore. I remember that case in when Bergoglio went to Ireland, which is supposed to be this loyal Catholic country. He got about 5% turnout at the rallies he was to speak at, that they figured. And Italy's a lot like Ireland. But so I think it's crumbling all over the world. And the more the reality of it crumbles, the more you have to create this edifice, this appearance that you're doing fine and you're reforming and we believe in children, all of this garbage, you know, that you can do with billions of dollars at your disposal. But the reality is something much more basic, and you're seeing it fall apart on the ground. And I travel a lot. I see that all over, you know.
Almost 2,000 watching live across all platforms presently. Please support Kevin's links and check out his books. And Ray J, do you see any connection between the anti-Russian agenda and American Pope being elected? That's interesting because you've touched on China quite a lot, but and China's and Russia seem to be quite close versus America's relationships with them.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is there. Like I say, there's a convergence happening, and you know, Trump made overtures to Russia and then to the Ukraine. You have to kind of you got to create a fog all the time. Machiavelli talks about this in The Prince. He says when you're a ruler, you got to always create a fog about what you're doing, and therefore it gives you freedom of action because you're basically robbing from and murdering people, but you have to appear behind a appearance of legitimacy to do that. So you got to always keep people confused about what you're really doing. And that's what's going on now. They're not going to blow the world apart in a war. They're going to converge. This is good business. This is good politics, just to work out the difference. And the Vatican's at the center of doing that. They're the power that financially and in other ways can bring them all together, and kind of in a nutshell. Yeah.
Angela wants to know, are there any reasons you're aware of that the cardinals didn't choose an Italian pope?
Well, don't forget, like the Ninth Circle is really being a lot of the news. It's coming out more and more, not in the mainstream corporate press, but all over people are aware of it. So you got to kind of de-emphasize that now. It's tied in with the old Italian mob. They're tied in with what's called 'Ndrangheta, which is the Italian mafia, or the European mafia, that provides a lot of the children and the teenagers and that for these rituals. So it makes sense to shift over to the New World and get an American in, somebody who is in South America. But unfortunately, by doing that, you're then exposing that whole Pacific Rim corruption and that we've been talking about. So it's just a shift to kind of get people. Don't forget, people have a 3-minute memory, right?
Mm-hmm. Is it possible they may have slowly poisoned the last pope to replace him?
I don't think they'd have to. I mean, he was pretty much playing along. He was instrumental with Pietro Parolin in getting the Chinese underwriting the Chinese for their Western Hemisphere expansion. And so, yeah, and they've already done that once. They don't need to. He was a loyal player from the beginning, ever since he was doing the deal with the junta in Argentina in the 80s.
Tammy wants to know, have you ever come across any information on the Black Pope?
Yeah, the Jesuits, people remember how we forced Ratzinger out of office, but they forget that we in fact forced the Jesuit head out of office, Adolfo Pichon, a year later, in April 2014, because we found that the Jesuits were at the center of so much of this historically, and they were kind of spearheading the move towards China, kind of shifting support. And I think that's one of the reasons he stepped down. But, they're like Pietro Parolin. They're financially as well, kind of the string puller, the kingmaker in the background, right?
So this question presupposes that the Vatican has financial problems. According to Kevin, the Vatican is sucking the financial wealth from all of the countries of the world into its own self. Papa is saying, can the Vatican's financial problems be fixed by having a savvy pope, or are they too deeply rooted?
Well, yeah, you're right, Sean. But here's the other thing too. Every time the Vatican talks about Vatican financial problems and financial reform, Bergoglio did that, and it was to cover up the fact that he was involved. For example, when he was in Argentina, he used the Vatican Bank to buy Exocet missiles for the Argentine junta in the Falklands War. And as a matter of fact, I know this from people in the British government, Maggie Thatcher was so angry at him for having done that she put out a hit on him. The MI6 was looking for a way to kill Archbishop Bergoglio, who would never become Pope Francis. But, so anyway, that's, so the whole talk of financial reform is propaganda to find a way to cover up corruption or even solidify their stuff even more, in the banks. So
Pam wants to know, has the Vatican Bank ever been robbed? That wouldn't end up very well for the robbers, I imagine. When you look at all of the stuff we've done with Kevin about, they've got their own intelligence agencies, they've got their own assassins, they've got their own military, their own police, their own laws.
Well, Roberto Calvi, we mentioned, the banker who was found hanging under, that's in the movie Godfather Part 2. They show him hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. But he was someone who was trying to steal. Steal, they're the biggest thieves in history, but to steal from them. And another thing to look at, though, which brings in the present Pope as well, he's from Chicago, and the Chicago Catholic Church are deeply involved with the Chicago mob. Cardinal Cody, C-O-D-Y, Paul Marcinkus. It's in this book, In God's Name, by David Yallop. It's about the assassination of Pope John Paul I. You should look it up. Y-A-L-L-O-P, David Yallop. And it goes into great detail of the connection between the Chicago Mafia and the Vatican, and how numerous popes, including Ratzinger, had advisors, cardinals who were openly mafia members, like Cardinal Beveluca in New Jersey, who just before the first trial of a whole bunch of priests in Philadelphia for raping, violating children, he died suddenly. Cardinal Beveluca dies in bed the day before he used to appear in court. And again, it's tied in with the mob connection between Chicago, i.e. present Pope, i.e. the Vatican Bank. So there you go.
Let me just give a definition before I ask you this question. So Operation Gladio was the code name for clandestine stay-behind operations organized by Western Union, NATO, and the CIA in collaboration with European intelligence agencies during the Cold War. Specifically, Gladio refers to the Italian branch of these networks. And the question from Ray is, are we seeing the modern version of Operation Gladio in plain sight?
I think it's ongoing, and it isn't connected to just one papal figurehead. An example of that too, and I think another reason they killed the guy in 1978, John Paul I, was he had found out about this thing called the P2 Lodge right in the College of Cardinals. And P2 wasn't just a Freemasons club, but it involved the biggest industrialists, generals, politicians in Italy. It was like a secret government within the government. And they were in touch with groups all over the world that have in place contingency plans for if a particular government is doing things they don't like, like taking over banks or trying to help the people more, whatever. That goes into place. They've got it in England. There was a movie called A Very British Coup back in the 80s about that eventuality where there was a Labour government, who started nationalizing banks. Boom, they were out. And the king invited in this new government kind of thing. So that's permanently in place. It's like private prisons. I mean, they're always there if they have to do a coup on somebody. And so that's the thing to keep in mind. Who bankrolls them? Guess who? Vatican Bank usually.
So Jen wants to know, will you be visiting the Vatican on your next trip to Rome, or are you banned?
I'm not banned at all. As a matter of fact, they expelled me from England. No, I will go there. I want to give talks in Rome, and maybe I'll even go visit Big Bob in the Vatican. What do you think, Bob Prevost? Sit down for tea. I mean, if the reason I'm not afraid about any of this stuff is because when you see through it, and I'll tell you something. The first time I was outside the Vatican when I did that exorcism in October 2009, I expected to feel really intimidated, right? I'm standing there and I shut my eyes and it feels like there's nothing there. It feels like there's nothing there. Like it's a big hologram and it's this big void. And I think, what do I have to be worried about, right? And when you have that awareness, you're elevated above this fear by which they control us. And I look forward to talking to Italians because I know a lot of them don't like what's going on, but they're trapped in the present system, right? And they need some alternatives, and that's what we're trying to create, right?
Linda wants to know, what is P2 in the Vatican?
It was like I said, a secret society involving a lot of cardinals. That was kind of part of the secret government system set up to take over if they needed to pull a coup. John Paul I, in his investigation of the Vatican Bank, uncovered this P2 thing, the P2 Lodge, and he began to ask questions about it. He was a funny guy. I mean, you talk about honest people in the church, like he did things like he didn't want to be carried in on the papal procession, right? He didn't like they had someone carrying him in on his back. His dad was a poor peasant who always voted left wing, right? So he had this kind of egalitarian roots, right? And he first thing he did is not only, he ordered the bishops, you can believe this, he ordered the bishops in Italy to start selling all their expensive jewelry and everything and start giving it away. In other words, he's reading the Bible too much. He's trying to do what Jesus said to do, right? He lasted 28 days. That's the thing to keep in mind, that, yeah, there are honest people in any corrupt system, but you can't stay honest if you stay in it. You've either got to collude, or you're either thrown out like I was, or you're killed. And, the beast can't have it any other way,
If the Vatican Bank was co-created by the CIA, why don't you go after them too?
It was created by Mussolini, actually, in 1929, the fascist dictator. But the Lateran Treaty that created the Vatican and gave it the power of the so-called government didn't end. When Mussolini was overthrown in 1943, remember when he was strung up by his heels in a square somewhere by partisans? That should have ended the Lateran Treaty right there, but it carried on because the CIA intervened. The first act of the CIA when it was formed in 1946 was to sabotage the Italian election. Or was it 1948? I think it was 48. Because the left, the communists and socialists, had been the main force in the resistance in Italy and France, and Nazis and the whole right wing were totally discredited, so was the church. Looked like they were going to win the elections in France and Italy. So the CIA funded the Christian Democrats in both countries, and they robbed the election. They stole the election. You know, they told all the Italian wives who went to church, all the bishops were saying, if you vote for the left, you're excommunicated, you'll go to hell. And the US Sixth Fleet was offshore Italy, ready to invade if the Communist Party was elected, or left wing. It was a communist socialist coalition that was going to lawfully take power, like in Chile in 1973 when they chopped it up. So the CIA has been very close to the Vatican Bank. How do you go after the CIA? You tell me.
Yeah, Kennedy tried. Look what happened to him. So TT wants to know, how modernized is the Vatican in terms of technology? Are they into AI and stuff like that?
All of it. They got the money. Why wouldn't they be? They got all the money in the world. A friend of mine, she was a Native woman. She was adopted and used in Vatican circles, but her stepfather kind of took kindly to her. His name was Cardinal Leger, and he took her on a tour beneath the Vatican Library. And she said, this was in the late 60s, state-of-the-art, military protected archives down there that were the length of football fields. I mean, really vast areas. And if they had that back then, of course they've got everything now, the IT and everything. So yeah, again, we need people on the inside to come forward with confirmation of that.
Ash wants to know whether you are aware of any other secrets hidden under the Vatican.
Well, I think I mentioned this in our first interview about my friend and Cardinal Leger. They were talking, and he showed her evidence that the Vatican had sponsored an archaeological excavation dig in Cyprus in the late 1950s, and they found hard evidence that Jesus had not died and had come and gone with Mary to the south of France. And there's, you know, in the Da Vinci Code, in that you saw a reference to that, of the Church of Mary Magdalene and those whole legends, but they had hard proof of that in not only archaeological but archival stuff. They found documentary evidence about his existence. And my friend asked Leger, like, why don't you share this with the people? And she said, then the church couldn't exist. I mean, if the people knew the truth about Jesus, why would they need the church? So they have to keep the lie going, and that's one of the things. But there's other a lot more heinous stuff down there. She saw fetuses, she saw body parts, she saw all sorts of weird things, weaponry. It's part of like what we found if you remember, I talked about the Anglican Indian school in Canada where we excavated, found bones of children and that were, identified as that. One of the things we found was a reference to early experiments done, torture threshold, pain threshold experiments on children, sponsored by the military, but to see how well the brain can endure and function under extreme pain, torture. And these were experiments funded before and after World War II. Nazi scientists came to Canada, sponsored by the Vatican, operating out of Catholic and Anglican churches. A lot of references to that down there. And there was in the diocese in Toronto, the Anglican church, but that was all destroyed. And when we went public with our investigation, it all got, well, at least removed from public access. It's probably still intact somewhere. That's the importance of insiders to give us this stuff. Yeah,
tying into that view, I just recently interviewed an MK Ultra survivor. It's a pre-record, and that one will be coming out soon. Luke wants to know, what of the Lateran Treaty of 1929? Why do US presidents recognize the papacy's status as head of state as well as head of the Roman Catholic institution?
Very vital question, because that's in a way at the heart of a lot of the problem. Lateran Treaty, like I just talked about, the Lateran Treaty continued unlawfully, because in the Cold War environment, the West needed the Catholic Church as a bulwark against the left, which was very large in Europe at the time. And also to, the permanent arms economy after World War II, it kept the world economy going. You need to create continual enemies everywhere. And the Catholic Church is great at doing that, right? So yeah, that's why the Lateran Treaty was kept. It's an illegal document now, but people still acknowledge it. And I already answered that thing about the U.S. government, recognizing the Vatican as a head of state, or as a state when it isn't. It's a fairy tale, right?
You're getting asked whether you thought it was inappropriate of Trump to do the AI picture of him as a pope.
I think it's inappropriate. I mean, the guy's a clown, he's a showman. And I don't think, I'm not even sure why Catholics were offended by it. It's just it's a farce. Why get upset about a farce?
D wants to know, is the Pope an extension of the head of the Roman Empire?
Well, he is the head of the Roman. That's the point. It's got a Christian veneer on it, but it's in every way, ideologically and politically, the way it operates. It is the Roman Empire. His title, Pontifex Maximus, was the title of the Roman emperors. The great bridge between heaven and earth. Dies et Dominus, man and God. They believe that he's God and a man. It's to a Christian, it should be blasphemous. And yet, what's really weird, Sean, is this belief in Christ can coexist alongside this belief in Antichrist. And no wonder it makes people nuts, right?
Do you think that these priests were violated as children, and that's why they become violators?
Well, that's the rhetoric. You can't really blame them because they were harmed as children. Everyone has a choice. I mean, I was harmed as a child in a hospital in Toronto. Didn't make me a child rapist. I mean, you can choose which way you want to go, right? But if you're in an institution that says, yes, you can harm children and get away with it, in fact, we encourage you to, everyone in the world who's like that knows they can become a Catholic priest and be protected. So who does that attract, right?
Yeah, and look at all the people who are violated as kids and don't go on to commit crimes.
Right.
And these predators go to places where they can access kids, and there's nothing more trusted by some people than a Catholic priest with the kids, and it's just instant access. Barb wants to know, is the new Pope a modernist?
No, nothing indicates he is. He's opposed to the ordination of women. He backs 100% the policy of Kremen, of protecting those who harm children within the church. So yeah, no, he isn't.
Do you believe that we will always have popes? That's from Amy.
I sure hope not. I think we should do everything possible to disestablish that institution, because you don't need it. If you're a Christian, Jesus never talked about popes, bishops, any of that. Go back to the source, read your scripture, and just follow that. You don't need any human institution.
What is a pope? That's from Chris. I'm really asking.
You mean officially, what is he? He's the Bishop of Rome. Pope is a neurolinguistic term designed. It's from Papa, father. He's everybody's father, you see. It's more the programming. But he's a CEO of the Vatican Incorporated. And here's a lot of other things. But people sometimes refer to the Pope as Antichrist. But in fact, the reference Antichrist refers to Rome. And in the book of Revelation, they talk about the beast with the 7 heads, 7 hells of Rome. The power in Rome, systemically, is Antichrist. And anyone who sits on the chair, the papal chair, becomes that and embodies it. Right? You could think of it as a spiritual possession, right? Very much.
Claudia wants to know, what happened to Pope John Paul I?
Well, we talked about that. They killed him, poisoned him.
What about the second?
Well, he was brought in to cover. Karol Wojtyła, Polish guy. He came in not only to cover for John Paul I, but America had not recognized the Vatican diplomatically until this guy. In 1982, Karol Wojtyła, the Polish guy, was brought in because, do you remember the Solidarity movement in Poland? It was the main
Lech Wałęsa.
Lech Walesa. Well, they were getting massive amounts of CIA money because it's right on the border of the old Soviet Union, and they wanted to destabilize Soviet Union, maybe provoke a war there, get another Czechoslovakia where Soviet tanks would go in. So the CIA was funding them through the Vatican Bank. And one of the conditions that Karol Wojtyła said is, we'll do this for you, but you have to recognize the Vatican. So Ronald Reagan recognizes the Vatican diplomatically, goes against the whole American tradition of separation of church and state, repudiating the Vatican as a government. After 1982, America's in the Vatican camp, and that's due to this John Paul II. So that's why they canonized him, made him a saint, because it's saintly to protect the finances of the Vatican. Don't you know?
What is the alternative to a pope?
No pope. You don't need a pope. You don't need him. Do your own thing, people.
What do you think the ratio of evil, corrupt priests is to non-evil?
Well, they're all expected to cooperate in the crime. That's the Kremlin policy. In the one case in America that went to court involving someone higher than a priest, the William Lynn case in Philadelphia, it was found that over 1/3 of all priests in the Philadelphia diocese were involved in this network with children. And, so the other 2/3 are expected to protect the 1/3 who are doing it. That's true in any corrupt institution. So they're all involved, either by act of commission or omission. You're all part of a criminal conspiracy. The law doesn't differentiate between a person killing someone and somebody who hid the murder weapon or stood by and watched to let it happen. You're all complicit in a crime, right? And that's the position of any Catholic in the church. You're all complicit as long as you're funding it and participating.
Alice wants to know, does the Catholic Church need to allow priests to marry, as in Orthodox religion? Would that take away this violation of kids and deviancy, etc.?
No, because it's a big business. What goes on with children, the way they're moved around and used and all of that, it makes a lot of money. So it's not really about that. Also, don't forget the celibacy thing was brought in the Second Lateran Council in the 16th century in response to the Reformation. In response to Luther exposing all this Vatican corruption and the Pope having mistresses, Pope Alexander VI had something like 100 mistresses and all these illegitimate children. They were worried that those children were going to all demand a chunk of Vatican money, right? They all expect to inherit. So practically, and to make it look like they're doing a spiritual facelift, the priests are all saintly now, they're all celibate. They brought in the celibate thing politically in response to the Reformation. And so it's always been just a gesture. People know priests aren't celibate. Every priest I've ever known is not being celibate. They've had mistresses on the side. It's just a game you play for the people in the pews, right?
Pam, everything that is corrupt in the world is linked. So it seems that there will never be any improvement. So children will continue to be violated and transported. Do you think this will ever stop?
Probably not. But it doesn't mean we have to go along with it. And the less people or more people who don't go along with it, the less likely it's going to be to happen. So it starts with each individual making that choice and expecting the shitstorm that follows. But that's why you got to link up in a movement with the rest of us, because we protect each other and make each other strong when we confront these evils. Right?
Question from Ray, reassessment of previous question. Isn't the Pope president of the Vatican? Is a demotion not a prime minister?
No, they don't use terms president and prime minister. Okay, in dethroning here, I actually have a quote from the College of Cardinals. Quote, the papacy is an absolute monarchy in which the head of state is the Pope, who holds full legislative, executive, and judicial power. In other words, it's kind of like being a pharaoh in ancient Egypt or a Roman emperor. Absolute monarch, right?
And let's see. So are you saying that Francis cleared up the priests who violated children? I have been a Catholic all my life. What you're saying is making me sick. That's Lorraine.
Cleared up the priests as in protected them? He's supposed to.
Yeah.
Okay, he's supposed to protect priests who assault children because that's their policy. And if he doesn't, they're all implicated. It's like what I found in the Indian schools in Canada. I talked to people who worked in these death camps where children were routinely killed. And the honest people said, well, if we talked about it, we'd go to jail. There was an understanding that from the government and the church that you cannot report this stuff. Otherwise, you're implicating yourself as well in the system. So there's a law of silence everybody operates by. And if they don't, they're crushed and you never hear about them again. Right?
Francis of Assisi on his deathbed prophesied an uncanonically elected pope who would be called the Destroyer. Is that Francis?
I think that's church propaganda because there's very little record actually of Francis of Assisi, and most of it comes through the church. So you got to always ask, where's its source? Where's it coming from, right? The problem with the Franciscans is they quickly became incorporated. Francis, before he died, said the first rule of the Franciscans was no priest was ever to handle money. Okay? The church was to remain poor. The Franciscan order was to remain poor. Within a century, you got a Franciscan pope conducting holy, quote, holy wars. And things like the guy in the third largest death camp in Europe in the 1940s was the Jasenovac death camp in Croatia, run directly out of the Vatican by a Franciscan bishop, Ivan Saric. So that's where Franciscans end up, corrupted by the church. So you got to always question these church kind of descriptions of Frank of Assisi.
AE wants to know the names of all your books.
Okay, well, my books you can see on Amazon. You can go to murderbydecree.com and go down the list. You'll see a lot of them listed. This is the one we're talking about, Dethroning a Rogue Power. And it was actually addressed to sympathetic people in the UN who are actually trying to move on it, trying to bring motions forward to have the Vatican expelled. And also just write to me, angelfire101@protonmail.com. I can get you the books. Depending on where you live, I lecture and travel all over North America and Europe, and will be again in the fall.
Claudia, have any clergy been shut down for trying to expose the violators?
You better believe it. And I know a lot of them. When I got thrown out of the United Church, I was part of a group called the Ministers' Mutual Aid. And do you know that about 1/3 of all clergy, and we're talking Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whoever, about 1/3 of us get forced out of the church through unlawful means or unfair labor practices. So just fired on the spot. The old guard don't like what your sermon was. You get canned, and blacklisted. There's a lot of clergy out there, men and women, who are put through hell, but they don't want to make controversy. There's this whole clergy attitude that, well, we don't want to divide and upset people. We need a 12-step group for ex-church people, and there's a lot of them out there. And I can work, I work with these folks, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with them, or if you know of anyone who needs that kind of help, just write me.
Yeah, that would be great. Let me see. Let's see. We're getting towards the final questions now. We're gonna have to end this at the hour. Kevin's almost been on for 2 hours right now, so get your final questions in, folks. Does the violation of the kids fracture the mind and cause multiple personalities and dissociative disorder?
Absolutely. That's one of the chief characteristics when you're violated. Now, it varies a lot. It doesn't hit everybody that way, but I learned in working with the Indian residential school death camp survivors, this was a big topic because a lot of them suffered from it. And what we found was the reason that children, when they're brought into these camps, they were deliberately raped. Any child who arrived on the truck was instantly raped. They were taken in, beaten, and raped. Now,
violated. Let's say violated.
Oh, okay.
It's okay.
Okay, I'll repeat that. Children who were brought in and were systematically violated, that was for a reason. We found this later through government and military files that were shared with us in the course of our first tribunal. It was done deliberately because when you violate somebody that way, the human mind dissociates. You create multiple personalities to survive. And that's why a killer, multiple personality killer, is often found not guilty, because you need intent to commit a crime, and they lack the intent because the other persona was doing it. Well, MK Ultra needed people, little children who were already programmed to have multiple personalities, because when you're creating like a sleeper agent or a sleeper assassin, that's what you need. You need MPD people. So these were factories producing MPD personalities. That's why our campaign and me and I have been so attacked, because we're uncovering stuff that's still being used and is being perfected in the era of COVID, right? So trace the source of things and you'll find out what's going on now, right?
Is the Vatican Bank underwriting BRICS new currency?
Yep, they're one of the main funders of it. I think the main funder.
M13, will the nature druids win over the sadistic church?
I hope so, because I'm descended from them. On my mom's side, we were O'Neills from Northern Ireland. We were the last of the Druid kings. And it was funny when I did that thing in Rome with the exorcism, the next morning that tornado hits, the first one in 48 years. And I'm thinking, my partner, Carol, said, well, you know, your ancestors are druids and they could control weather, Kev. Maybe they were your ancestors were kind of plugging into what you're doing there. I don't know, but it's, the druids have gotten a bad shaft from the church. You know, they sacrificed children and all that because they were the spiritual opposition when the Church of Rome was taking over that whole in Britain and Ireland and that. So, you know, the Romans went in and destroyed all the Druid encampment, and Anglesey, I think, was that they just massacred every Druid they could find because they were earth-based, nature-based, you know, natural law, the opposition to papacy, right?
If all good Catholics leave, then they would have less power, right?
Who would have less power? The church? Yeah.
The good ones. Does it mean that it would become more evil? The church would become even more evil if all the good ones left?
Well, they're not sustained by their members. That's the thing about, you could have 5 Catholics in the world and would continue because they're not essentially membership driven. They're driven by money and power. And they would maintain the facade. They need to maintain the facade. So no, if you leave, if a lot of good people leave, you're saving the lives of children because, you know, you won't have that participation and it'll be seen for what it is, not a church, but a criminal money-sucking power.
Just need to give a disclaimer before I give you this question. I'll say that sarcasm is the height of an intellectual cripple because this is from my partner, mother of baby Ziggy. Kevin, would you please bring some holy water from your trip to Italy for Sean? He needs it.
Oh, that's really cute. Well, all water is holy. All water is holy. It's not blessed or made that way. So. But I'll come and I'll do a water fight with him if you want when I come.
Get the pistols out. Does Islam come from Catholicism? Well, if you read the Torah, which came before the Bible and came before the Quran, they both seem to plagiarize the Torah, don't they?
Well, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, it's a really common faith. It comes from that same part of the world. God is a conqueror. Women are subordinate. It's the same source, I think. So who affected who? I think they all affected each other, kind of in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of the same characters in all 3 books, and there's been so many wars over definitions and how stories are written. It's crazy. Why are there no female popes?
Well, we talked about this. There was once, but she was murdered. Pope Joan, the legend is that she was an English cardinal who hid herself. She was very smart and impressed people, I think around the 9th century. And she hid her sexuality on a papal procession in Rome. She got pregnant, and on a papal procession in Rome, she gave birth to the child. And when they found out, they thought it was a miracle at first, right? But then when they found out she was a woman, they killed her on the spot, her and the baby. And in Rome, you might want to look, there's supposed to be a monument there still to her. But there's never been one because they believe women are evil and, you know, descendant of Eve, and only a man. God has testicles, right? Isn't that obvious?
Angela's inviting you to New Zealand to promote what you do. They would love this.
I'd love to come, but you'd have to help find the money to get me there because I am on a blacklist and don't have a lot of travel funds. But I would love to come. In fact, I've been invited to come to New Zealand and Australia a number of times because of the severity of what happened to Indigenous people there, and also the role of the papacy in that.
I'll answer this next one. You're getting asked what was the longest ever conclave, and I've looked it up on Google, and it is the 1268 to 71 papal election. 1268-71, following the death of Pope Clement the Fourth, was the longest papal election in history. There we go.
That'd be interesting to look into.
Yeah. Let me see. I think we're almost. Is it true, in your opinion, that only the red bits in the Bible are legit and the rest has been doctored to trick us?
Well, what I know about that is that there was this thing called in Chicago. They brought together 100 seminarians in what's called the Jesus Project, and they did a study of the New Testament and figured out what was more likely to have been actual sayings of Jesus and what were things attributed later, like the birth narrative, Jesus being born in Bethlehem. That the church put that in order to show he was a descendant of David. I mean, but there were a few simple sayings. And they said the simpler the saying, the more likely it would be to be passed word of mouth, passed on to people. Something like the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed within you, right? That saying likely came from Jesus. And they actually, I use this in sermons, and it was really great because the red lettered areas of the Bible were more likely to come from Jesus. And then black and gray indicated, no, they were created and attributed to him later by the church. Only about 12% of what's in the New Testament was attributed directly to Jesus. So it's more likely that only around 10% of his actual words in the Bible came from the historical guy, Yeshua ben Yosef, right? Jesus being the Greek word for him. So when they have red bits in the Bible, I think it's not only that, but also to emphasize what the editors thought were the most important parts of the Bible. But I know that academic, scholarly consensus seems to be that the shorter the sayings from Jesus, the more likely it was that it was actually said by him.
Do you know anything about the girl who was kidnapped, her father suddenly given a good job in the Vatican, subsequently her brother?
I'm trying to remember that case. I remember it, and I'll have to look that up. I can't give a good answer to that right now, but it was connected to a guy who started, wasn't he an employee of the Vatican who started talking about Ratzinger? And then suddenly all these things, he got arrested and put in a Vatican prison. You see, they have their own prisons. They can lock up church dissidents and the law can't touch them. This guy was in a Vatican prison and then his child died and all that. So yeah, it was to shut him up.
Is the Pope going to tell us what happened to Emmanuel's Orlandi?
I think it's that the guy we're referring to. I'm not sure. Otherwise, I'm not sure who Orlandi is.
Do you know anything about Pope Peter and the upside down cross? There are upside down crosses in the Vatican.
That's part of the myth. Peter was never a pope. That comes from the whole basis of the church claiming, that they have authority is that Jesus said, I'm going to build my church on Peter, when he wasn't talking about establishing a church. That was just editorialized later.
Right. We're almost at the hour, folks. And oh, here we go. Do you know anything about Melbourne being built on ley lines and used for satanic rituals?
Melbourne. We've done a lot of work on Melbourne, the whole thing. Tos von Nieuwenhuis, who was in the Ninth Circle, was taken to Melbourne as a child. She was taken into not only hospitals, but military facilities and was used experimentally. She saw children in cages there, having weapons tested on them, chemical weaponry and that. We've done a lot on Melbourne. I can't go into great detail here, but write to me. I can send you stuff. And if and when I come to Australia, it definitely is a place to hit. And one of our people, Georgina Cameron, who was investigating that, got killed. And we know who did it and people in the church responsible. So yeah, please write to me.
Kevin is on his A game, Sophia. He's been absolutely on fire tonight. Obviously, you know that this Pope story is one of the biggest stories in the world right now, and he's extremely busy. He's been very generous, spending 2 hours with us. And thank you, everyone, for keeping your questions on point. This has been absolutely fascinating. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion, Kevin?
Lots, but I would like to soon come back and talk about getting more on the ground about what we've documented about what goes on in these networks, especially in the West Coast, which I think we should focus on in terms of the present fellow in office, Leo the 14th, because that's going to open up a lot more, including the Pan-Pacific Chinese network behind a lot of these crimes and the role of China. And also to talk about my upcoming trip to Europe. And I really want to urge people to book me into places in Europe. And also I'll be in Canada, America, and then over to Europe for when universities open in September. So let's try to arrange a speaking tour, and we can meet a lot of you folks in person and carry on this work.
Come and spend the night at our house if you want, Kevin.
Hey, I'll do it if they let me into England, but they deported me in 2011, so we'll see.
Oh no, oh no, oh no. Viewers, put a 1 in the chat if you'd like Kevin to come back soon. Put a 2 in the chat if you want him to bog off. I know it's all going to be 1s. And all of Kevin's links, as I've said, are in the description box. His books. You can reach out to him. You can listen to his other broadcasts. The older ones piling in. And yet again, thank you so much, my friend, coming on for such short notice. And we hope to see you soon. It's 99.9% want you to come back. All right.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, everyone. Carry it on.
Take care, Kevin. Cheers. Good night. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye. All right, folks. What a phenomenal guest. Absolutely fascinating. And good timing, isn't it? With all of the black smoke and the Pope, the new Pope. All right, so tomorrow night, Professor Hamamoto on Diddy, Virginia, Weinstein. We possibly have Chris Todd on McCann. We've not heard from Epstein's niece, Anya Wick, this week. So that's pending. And but it's going to be another blockbuster night tomorrow night. Juliet Bryan podcast edits are almost finished on the pre-record there, Epstein Survivor. So that will be coming soon. And we've also got Anna Lee, our MK Ultra Survivor, going through the edits now. That podcast will be coming soon. And everyone seems to be really enjoying the David Icke upload we did today, the banned content. We carefully removed lots of words from it, so it's within the community guidelines. If you missed that one, check it out. And before that one this morning, we interviewed a survivor of Christian Bruckner, the suspect in the Madeleine McCann case. We were all in tears. She told the story so well. She just woke up in her hotel room in Portugal, and there's a man saying her name, stood there, dressed in black, and it just gets more and more horrific from there. So if you missed that one, it's almost 2 hours long. I would urge people to find that one that we did earlier today. She was live, absolutely brave, warrior spirit, and it affected me all day after speaking to her. But her energy and her smile were radiant, and it was good to see after everything she went through. So thank you for supporting all of our guests. We have an eclectic range of them with varied viewpoints that we may not all agree with everything they say, but our job is just to bring them to you guys so you can become informed, learn more like we learn more, speaking to these people, and form your own decisions and conclusions. So we'll see some of you tomorrow.